And
Jason,
uh,
yeah.
and today I'm pleased to introduce Jeff Mitchell. He is going to be giving an update on net neutrality, a little bit of an overview, and some of the current states of what's going on nationally and within some of the regions that a lot of you represent. So I'll turn it over to you, Jeff.
Thanks, Jason. Well, I'm really glad to be here. We'll try to, I have about 12 slides that I'd like to walk through, and then hopefully have some discussion at the end, answer any questions to the best of my ability that folks may have. I been working with Jen Leisure and the Quilt for about a year and a half on various issues. Work at a occasion to work with Jared and EDUCAUSE and some of the other higher ed folks on the net neutrality work. So I'm going to share with you some of the what we did on that. But basically, I'm a telecom attorney. I've been at this since '99. I focus on universal service and rural broadband, so I kind of come at these issues from that perspective. So get right into it. I guess I'll skip to the punchline and just tell you that there is a lot going on in the states, and we'll get to that at the end. I want everyone to understand why there's so much going on in the states, and there's a little bit going on in Congress, and then there's a flurry of activity with respect to what's going on in the courts and the efforts to challenge what the FCC has done. So our agenda, I want to give a little bit of an overview of the timeline of events that got us to where we're at right now. I have one slide on exactly what the FCC decided in 2015, what they decided in December of 2017. Talk briefly about what the response of the higher education community was through comments to what the FCC did in December. And like I said, we'll talk about what we can anticipate in the courts, in Congress, and what the states are up to and what we might see the results of that. So before we get to that, what exactly is net neutrality? And I think it's important to know what it's not. We're not talking about forcing everyone to buy the exact same thing from their provider. It allows people to get different levels of service. It allows people to get faster service. It doesn't require ISPs to treat everything equally. There's lots of room for network management activities, prioritize traffic for telehealth and public safety. And it doesn't prohibit fast lanes, but these are the fast lanes that you would obtain through private network connectivity, which is not affected by any of the net neutrality rules that were promulgated in 2015. So what is it then? It's that the public internet must remain open to the public. I mean, I think there's two good analogies. Or what we have with cable TV is where the local providers have the ability to choose what channels you can see, but in exchange for that franchise, the FCC requires them to carry a number of channels that provide access to public information as part of the deal. And with the public telephone network that we've all grown up with, it's always been the case that everybody can call everybody, and the carriers can't choose or listen to the calls, and they can't choose, who can call whom. So those are the two analogies that I think we're trying to, with respect to the public internet, incorporate those concepts into that. And that's what net neutrality is and was an attempt to do. I think the history actually goes back before this, and I'm not going to spend too much on this slide. This is an easy slide for me, in particular as a lawyer, to get bogged down in. But I think that a couple things I want to highlight. You really began to see, we had internet access through dial-up. That was the first way that people accessed the internet, and you could dial up depending on the number that you called. A number of different ISPs. What you started to see in the early 2000s, especially, was the first kind of broadband internet access, and there were two flavors. There was the DSL access, which was using your copper wire that you got your phone line from to deliver, what then was considered fast access, much faster than dial-up access to the internet. And then you had the cable companies that were providing internet access. using their coaxial cables into everyone's home. And they were treated differently. The cable companies were more or less unregulated with respect to that broadband internet access. And the phone companies were pretty highly regulated with respect to the DSL. And what that meant, among other things, was that they actually had to provide wholesale DSL to their competitors if their competitors wanted to provide internet access. And so you might be getting your phone line from your local, what was then Bell Atlantic, for example, but you would be getting your internet access from another company because that company was being required under the FCC rules, or was being allowed to lease the facility, just the DSL component of that line to provide internet access. And so the phone companies were very upset about this, that they were trying to compete, they felt, with the cable companies, and they were being forced to do things that the cable companies weren't being forced to do. And so one of the questions at the time was whether the cable internet access service should be treated more like a phone service, more like DSL. And so one of the first big decisions on this was in 2002 when the FCC decided not to treat cable internet access like DSL, like a telecommunication service. And that's the case called Brand X. It actually went up to the Supreme Court in 2005, where the Supreme Court upheld the FCC's decision not to regulate cable internet access in the same way as DSL. That's a prominently cited case by both sides in this debate. That was one of the kind of significant decisions along the way. In 2005, the same year that Brand X was decided, the FCC deregulated DSL, where they no longer essentially allowed it to be on more of a even footing with the cable companies. So those are just kind of 2 points on this timeline I wanted to highlight. The other, this is not an attempt to capture all the instances of discriminatory conduct that have occurred over the years. These are just sort of the legally significant ones that ended up being court cases. So you had Comcast and BitTorrent in 2008, which resulted in one of the first big court cases on the subject, which found that the FCC didn't have the authority to do what it did. Not that what it was trying to do was not good, it's just that it didn't have the legal authority to do it. And you saw several iterations where the FCC took a couple runs at trying to come up with rules that would sufficiently protect an open internet and yet not exceed its authority as the courts saw it. So that kind of sets the stage for another decision in 2014 by the DC Circuit, and then ultimately in 2015 the FCC really deciding to take a different approach and just out and out treat broadband internet access as a telecommunication service. And that's when we talk about the terms telecommunications, common carrier, Title II. Those are things that are what we're talking about when we're talking about regulating something as regulating it in the full authority of the FCC under Title II as a common carrier telecommunication service. When we talk about an information service, that's something the FCC has much less authority to regulate. And so I'm going to go to the next slide, where there's really three major areas of three major arenas that these arguments are taking place in. And as a lawyer, I look at it this way. I'm not sure everybody does. There's actually a fourth arena in there, which is politics, which someone reminded me not to ignore that, because I think in some ways that's the most significant of all four arenas. But the three areas that the lawyers focus on most are the policy arguments, which are the merits of a particular policy, the legal arguments, which is notwithstanding the merits, does the agency in question, if that's what we're talking about, an agency, have the authority? Has Congress granted the authority to the agency to regulate in that area, regardless of whether it's a good thing that they're doing or not? And so in the case of net neutrality, you go to the statute that governs what the FCC does. There's the Telecommunications Act of 1934 and 1996, and the Communications Act of 34, and then the Telecommunications Act of 96. And they have these definitions in there for something called telecommunication services, which is a common carrier service regulated under Title I of that statute. And they have a definition of something called an information service that's regulated under Title II. And so a huge amount of the debate is, what is the scope of the FCC's authority? What do those terms mean? And if, depending on how you come out on that issue, and that's both a legal and a factual question, what are the nature of the services we're talking? What did, people mean at various times in history when they used those terms? But the FCC in 2015 concluded that broadband internet access was a telecommunication service under Title II, which gave the FCC broad authority to do a variety of things if it wanted to do. And then what we saw in 2017 was the FCC concluding that no, changing its mind essentially and concluding no, it's not a telecommunication service, it's an information service, which gives them a lot less authority. Doesn't give them no authority, but gives them a lot less authority to do various things with it. So these are kind of the three different areas. In my mind, I like to keep them distinct, so I know what I'm arguing about. I know what I'm, what arena I'm in. And you can see under the policy one that and there's certainly a lot of overlap and interplay between these areas, but certainly you could reach a position where the policy is absolutely something you support, but you nonetheless conclude that you can't do it even though it's a really good policy. What the commission just did was conclude that they didn't have the legal authority to do anything, notwithstanding that the commission 2 years where it concluded that it did, and the courts had upheld that, but the FCC concluded they didn't have authority, and they also concluded separately that they didn't agree that the policy was a good one, and we'll get into that a little bit on the actual slide associated with the decision. So this is what they did in 2015, protecting the open internet, the order that came out then. They concluded that broadband internet access service is a telecommunication service, giving the FCC broad authority under Title II. They promulgated rules prohibiting blocking, throttling, and paid priority. It applied only to broadband internet access, which was retail consumer broadband. It excluded R&E networks, content delivery networks, cable, voice over internet, telemedicine applications, public safety, things of that nature. But it didn't apply to those applications. It prohibited the ISPs from engaging any other, sort of undefined type of conduct that could harm consumers or edge providers. And it came to be known as the General Conduct Rule, but it was an open internet conduct rule. It required ISPs to engage in just and reasonable practices when they interconnect with other providers, and it had a strong preemption provision, not allowing the states to promulgate rules that would go in a different direction. This also at this time preempted the states from, and this, I don't want to get bogged down in this idea of USF contributions, but universal service funding is one of the ways we keep the network accessible all around the country in rural and non-rural areas. And potentially by doing this Title II classification, it would have opened up a new avenue to fund universal service, but the FCC wasn't ready to take that step in this order, so they said they weren't going to do that yet, and then they preempted the states from also going in that direction yet. So that's what happened in 2015. In 2017, they just went in a completely different direction. And I forgot to mention, in addition, in 2015, mobile broadband had always been not considered a common carrier service. Your voice service on your cell phone was regulated as a common carrier service. Your data service, your internet access on your mobile phone was not regulated as a common carrier service. And that was another thing that the FCC did in 2015, is they brought net neutrality to mobile broadband as well as fixed broadband. 2017, they did a complete 180. They concluded that broadband internet access is an information service. They could only do light touch authority under Title I. They reversed on mobile broadband, said it's non-common carrier. They eliminated the express rules on blocking, throttling, and paid prioritization, ISP conduct, and just and reasonable interconnection. All those rules went out the window. They instituted a single rule, which hasn't come into effect yet, but it will at some point once it gets approved by the Office of Management and Budget, on transparency, and simply requiring that whatever the ISPs do in these areas with respect to blocking, throttling, paid prioritization, that they need to make that information, publicly announce that to their customers in advance. And then they continued this idea that the states were preempted from doing anything differently than what the commission decided here. So that was their sort of legal conclusions. And then they sort of separately made their policy conclusions. And they sort of said, our legal conclusions stand separately, but in addition, we reached these policy conclusions that they actually think paid priority is a good idea. That's one of the things they think will fund greater network deployment. They don't think blocking and throttling are likely to occur, partly due to competition and partly due, that there's enough competition out there that there'll always be a carrier, willing to offer a service that's unblocked and unthrottled, and that they'll have the market advantage. And that there will be opportunities for the Federal Trade Commission to pursue, and I do have a slide, by the way, on the Federal Trade Commission at the very end, because there's a significant decision on that I want to talk about that comes into play here as to what exactly the Federal Trade Commission can and cannot do in these areas. And we'll talk about that. But this commission took the position that the Federal Trade Commission is better positioned to address or at least positioned well enough to address these issues, given their assessment that it's not likely to be a frequent occurrence, and that they just overall concluded that they thought Title II would actually impose substantial costs on carriers and depress investment. So that was essentially where they ended up. So higher education did participate in the 2017 proceeding. Well, they participated in both proceedings, but I worked with them in the 2017 proceeding. And, we were trying to map out a middle ground for the commission to take to sort of not get too involved in the legal arguments, essentially saying to the FCC, look, the courts have told you that there's more than one way for you guys to do this, to provide net neutrality rules. Title II was one way, but the courts had also suggested a third way. And we urged them to, if they did decide to reverse on Title II, which we urged them not to do, to at least take the third way. And we made, I think, points that tie into, a little bit what we talked about at the beginning about, this idea of public access and the public importance of the public having access to unfettered access to public information. And that there's a civic component here that seemed to get ignored in the most recent order, and that I think are embodied by libraries and higher education in terms of they are the public access links for the public internet. And a lot of the remedies that the commission claims are available won't necessarily be available to higher education. They're not going to have deep pockets to pursue litigation, antitrust, or complaints to the Federal Trade Commission. They're not going to be in a position to have deep pockets to purchase priority access. And then we just essentially criticized the commission for really, I think, not sort of taking this position that they were somehow restoring a status quo that had been in place for a really long time, when I think that's probably not a fair characterization of what happened. I mean, the last, it's just not that simple, as we talked about with what was going on in the early 2000s with cable modem and DSL, that there was a period of time when access to the internet was regulated through the DSL rules. So we flew the flag. I think there was this sense that this commission was going to already do what it said it was going to do. And I think we just tried to sort of, have a, really make them think twice about it as much as we could. And along with many other people, we were not successful in doing that. So now we go to court. And we've had 15 separate petitions for appeal that were filed in two federal circuit courts California filed to the California Public Utilities Commission and the County of Santa Clara, and other parties filed in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. There was actually a lottery, multi-district lottery that occurred yesterday, where the Ninth Circuit was randomly chosen between those two circuits to be the circuit where this case could get heard. And I say could because it's still, the parties may seek leave to have it transferred to the DC Circuit. And what I read this morning in the trade press about this is that one of the things is the Ninth Circuit actually has a much bigger backlog than the DC Circuit. It could be up to 3 years for the Ninth Circuit to get around issuing a decision in this case, given their normal caseload. The DC Circuit typically renders a decision within a year. So there may be an incentive for parties to seek transfer, setting aside which circuit might be more favorable to the decision. I think this perception now is that the DC Circuit is more favorable than it used to be to the FCC. They used to routinely, well, I don't want to make it for or against the FCC. It used to be that the DC Circuit was more conservative, let's say, and so, but that's not necessarily the case. As compared to the Ninth Circuit, for example, that's not necessarily the case anymore. And now, when you've got this backlog issue, there may be real incentives for people to seek transfer to the DC Circuit to get a quicker decision. No parties yet have indicated that they're going to seek a stay. Now, a stay would be requesting the court prior to its actually issuing a decision, yay or nay in this case, to actually stop the rules from taking effect while it considers the arguments. It's a pretty high hurdle to get a court to actually stop something from happening before it's even had a chance to hear, the arguments from both sides. It does happen, but parties are indicating that, there was a report earlier this week in the trade press where a lot of folks are going to wait for the actual effective date of the rules, which still may not be till the summer. The order was published in what they call the Federal Register about 2 weeks ago, which started a number of clocks running with respect to the effective date of the rules and then these appeal deadlines. So it may be hard to sort of make a case for a stay if, and the other thing that's happening is all the ISPs are on their best behavior. They're all saying, well, no, we're not going to engage in any of these practices. We've already told you we're not going to do that. And so, they'll wait until, if they are going to start engaging in those practices, they'll wait till after, the court case is underway, because if they do engage in those practices now, it could create more of an argument for a stay. So one theory is that they're going to intentionally hold off to avoid giving anyone an argument in front of the court that a stay is needed. So I think people are thinking now that there may not be people seeking a stay, but no one's committing to it one way or the other. So the big hurdle in court is something called Chevron deference. And Chevron is a Supreme Court case. It's from the early 80s, I think. It's pretty old. It's very well-established law, and essentially says that when an agency is interpreting statutory language in a law that's ambiguous, the agency gets to decide which way to interpret, as long as it's sort of good faith, decision-making, as long as it's not arbitrary and capricious. The Supreme Court in Brand X already has concluded that the definitions of the terms telecommunication service and information service, which is the central issue in this case, are ambiguous. So that's already been determined by the Supreme Court, that we're looking at an ambiguous statute. And so, one theory is that we do have a somewhat unique situation in that there's a level of kind of uncertainty in the marketplace right now because of these reversals on this extremely important issue, that maybe there's an argument for the court to sort of, notwithstanding Chevron, to kind of put the brakes on this, to, that there's a kind of an unprecedented situation that we have here rather than a run-of-the-mill Chevron case. So that's going to be one of the big arguments on appeal. Or, whether in fact what they've done is arbitrary and capricious, which I think is hard to do if you have a statute that's already been found to be ambiguous. But we just kind of have to see. We've got quite a few parties, obviously, who are lined up to file appeals, and it's going to be the one thing you can say about it is that it's going to go on for a few more years at the court level. And, keeping in mind that we also have a Supreme Court appeal that's pending still on the 2015 order. And that order was appealed initially to the DC Circuit, upheld by a 3-panel. Then it was appealed again. Well, essentially it was they asked for rehearing where the full DC Circuit heard it and upheld it a second time. So it's been upheld. The 2015 decision has been upheld twice by the DC Circuit, and now there's an appeal pending at the Supreme Court. So there are a lot of balls in the air on the court side, and a lot still yet to happen. So now we looked at Congress, which is, in theory, Congress is the one that could potentially resolve this, because if they pass a clear statute telling the FCC what it can and can't do, that kind of settles the issue. But before we even get to that, there's something called the Congressional Review Act, which a lot of folks may have heard about in the first few months of the Trump administration, or there were quite a number of applications of this against Obama-era rules that were overturned by Congress. And the Congressional Review Act allows the majority of Congress to reverse something that an agency's done if it's happened within a particular period of time prior to the Congress, a new Congress coming into office. And so you now have a situation where the Congressional Review Act is potentially able to be used against the FCC's net neutrality, the most recent net neutrality decision in 2017. With publication in the Federal Register a couple of weeks ago, that started the clock ticking on this. And there are already 49, they only need 51 votes in the Senate to force this to move forward, and they've got 50. They've got 49 Democrats and Susan Collins from Maine. And so it'll only take one more Republican to win in the Senate to essentially disapprove of what the FCC's done. But they will actually have to win in the House too, and that's going to be much harder to do. And I think the primary goal here is to force this issue up into the front in an election year, because it is a popular issue. Politics have tended to be on the side of the proponents of net neutrality. And so I don't think the CRA effort is going to be successful in actually stopping the rule, but it will definitely be successful in forcing it in the forefront during an election year. There is a bipartisan net neutrality. Well, no, there is the possibility of a bipartisan net neutrality bill. There is a bill pending that's been introduced in both the House and the Senate called the Open Internet Preservation Act that would give the FCC authority to prohibit blocking and throttling. It would not extend to paid prioritization. And so that's the sticking point for any type of bipartisan agreement. That's the area of the primary area of disagreement right now between the two parties. My last bullet there, strategic non-resolution, is just the recognition that both parties do this. Sometimes there is an advantage to keeping an issue unresolved because it motivates the base and generates a lot of contributions. So there are the politics on one hand may be in supporting net neutrality itself, but that doesn't necessarily translate into an actual piece of legislation, at least not yet. So I actually don't see prospects in Congress, certainly not before the election, of anything happening. After the election, of course, we just will have to see. All right, so what is going on in the states? As I mentioned already, one of the lawsuits pending is from the attorneys general of 23 states. They're listed here. It's tough to get an exact count, but I saw a report that 22 states are considering some type of net neutrality laws to fill the gap here. There's a couple different, there's two flavors of laws we're seeing. One are grant and procurement laws, where you've got states essentially saying if you're an ISP and you want to contract with state government to provide services, you've got to adhere to net neutrality principles. So that's sort of the one flavor. The other flavor in Washington State, I think this week, the governor signed their law that essentially requires net neutrality in Washington State. Now, and then there's hearings coming up in Massachusetts and Tennessee. I saw reports this week. So the the issue on, and this all gets to the issue of preemption. So one of the interesting questions, if the FCC concludes that Congress hasn't given it authority to regulate in a particular area, like broadband internet access, how then does the FCC preempt states from regulating in that area? That's an interesting legal question that I've seen floated around. So these cases of the states imposing their own net neutrality rules, whether through a procurement law or directly like Washington State has done and other states may follow. Hawaii is another state, I think, considering a direct regulation. Those are probably going to end up in court as well. And one of the questions will be, has the FCC preempted each of these kinds of laws? The other issue is, certainly will these laws affect interstate commerce? Because that's where the feds come in and are able to sort of override state jurisdiction when the states do things that affect commerce outside of their state. And so, one of the ISPs are going to argue and are already arguing that, look, if I have to, change my network, it's impossible for me to change my network just for the services that I provide within California or within a particular state. It's going to force me to change, my network practices across the board, and that's going to affect interstate commerce. So that's what the arguments are going to be back and forth here. But this is going to be a whole other litigation track that's going to end up in the courts that we'll have to be following closely. All right, so I hope I'm not moving too fast. I want to talk a little bit about, this is another case. This was actually just decided in the last couple weeks, and this gets right to the issue of whether the FTC really is in a position to do something about these issues now that the FCC's more or less abdicated its authority to do anything here. And the case here started in 2014, which was before the 2015 Open Internet Order. And at that time, mobile broadband was not considered a common carrier service. And so the Federal Trade Commission sued the AT&T for throttling customers who had purchased unlimited plans, data plans from AT&T. And the issue here isn't throttling per se, it's that they advertised unlimited plans and then they throttled. So it's a deceptive advertising case. What the case was whether this question of the Federal Trade Communication Act, the act that governs the jurisdiction of the Federal Trade Commission, does not give the FTC jurisdiction over common carriers. And the AT&T argued that because they were a common carrier, even though this particular service they was providing was a non-common carrier service, they were, the FTC couldn't come after them. So that's the case that was recently decided. And the Ninth Circuit decided, no, the FTC does have authority to pursue common carriers that are engaged in non-common carrier activities. So this is a case I wanted to just cover it. By the way, that horse that you're seeing is one of the statues on the front of the building that houses the FTC. That's why it's here. I wanted to mention that. But one of the things that so this big debate about whether the Federal Trade Commission is the more appropriate cop in the beat. I mean, what people are pointing out is the Federal Trade Commission can only go after practices that are, deceptive or, or unfair. In this case, for example, throttling was not the practice that was problematic. It was the advertising that made it problematic. So the FTC is never going to be able to go after blocking and throttling if it's properly disclosed. So that's an example of where the FTC is not necessarily going to be able to do the kinds of things that the FCC could do, even in a best case scenario. All right, so I have actually gone through all my slides, and I'm hoping we'll have some good questions.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jeff. A reminder to everybody: just type in your questions, and we'll get them to you. So I guess I have a first one to sort of kick us off here. I think you said it a little bit earlier. Because things are sort of so up in the air right now. It's your opinion, or you can tell me if it's your opinion, that you don't think that any company is really going to try to go out and do anything drastic. It's sort of going to be business as usual for a little bit. How long would that scare them into keeping it business as usual? Or when would we start to see the first impacts of this once things start to shake out a little bit more?
Well, I do think, I don't know. I think they obviously don't want to give ammunition for a stay. And so the time to seek a stay, I think will be within, and I don't know, it's either going to be 30 or 60 days after the rule goes into effect. And the rule will probably go into effect. And the rule we're referring now to is the transparency rule, which is the sole substitute for all the rules that were repealed. I think that rule, most of the order will go into effect in April of this year. The transparency rule has to go to the sort of Office of Management and Budget for approval under something called the Paperwork Reduction Act. That typically takes a couple of months. So I think it's once the actual effective date of that rule is known, that will sort of trigger anyone who could potentially try to go in and argue that this all has to be stopped. So I'm thinking that this year, I don't see, and then you've got the election as well, thinking more broadly into sort of the politics of this. I would say this year, I don't see any dramatic action. Now, paid priority is something a little different. I think the carriers are taking the position that they can do paid priority. They're not even saying that they're necessarily going to withhold from that. But blocking and throttling, they're all publicly saying, oh, well, we're not going to do that. Our customers don't want that. We're not going to do that. So I think this year is probably continue to be a sensitive year politically for the carriers. One thing I didn't include on my timeline, and folks don't even remember this, I think it was in 2008 when AT&T Wireless blocked FaceTime, Apple FaceTime, when it really started taking off. And there was a public outcry over it, and the FCC or no federal agency actually ever got involved. There was just such a public outcry over it that they stopped. So that is an element of the dynamic here. Is I think the carriers do respond to negative publicity, but as the longer time goes on, I think their comfort level will go up as to what they're willing to try to do.
So you mentioned paid priority, and I think that many of us may have even seen this already, where, there's been blog postings and various statements from members of the quote unquote research side of the telecoms that have been saying, oh, we're investigating this. Is that really where we're going to see the first shots come instead of the blocking and throttling, since that's such a politically hot issue? Will paid priority sort of be the first way that they try to get their feet wet with this?
I would think so. I think the argument on paid priority that the commission made and that the carriers make is like, look, if we can charge more, we'll be able to build more. And, I think in theory, if they can make more on their facilities, they'll build more facilities, but they'll only build facilities where they can make more money. They're not going to build facilities in rural areas, for example. No matter what. So my feeling on this issue of, will this lead to greater network deployment is it could in some places, but it will be very uneven, and it will not address, the other part of, of net neutrality, in my view, is universal service, is that everybody needs to have the physical facilities in place to be able to access the network, or all this stuff's moot anyway. And that's where I have a lot of concern, is that what we're seeing, this sort of privatization of all of the network, really is undermining our commitment to universal service in our country, which is a statutory commitment. This is a commitment Congress made in '96. It's not an ambiguous law at all. It's quite clear, and that's where I think we're running into trouble. And so, if there's enough network facilities out there that they can charge for priority and give everyone else great service, then, in theory, it wouldn't be a problem. But I think there's still going to be places where there's not enough network. And in those places, you could see service degraded, depending on how this gets handled. I think the transparency rule says that whatever they do, they've got to tell you what they're doing. So in theory, I think that applies to paid priority. So if they're engaging in paid priority arrangements, how that gets disclosed will be, I think, one way that we'll really have to monitor, like the details of that disclosure, like how transparent is their disclosure, like how are they going to word it, how are they going to tell you that this is actually happening so that you'll be able to respond to it, either with public criticism or changing carriers if that's an option that you have.
Okay. Jen has typed in, can you describe the main thrusts of content providers' comments and actions regarding the 2017 FCC action on net neutrality?
Well, that's a tough one. I think there was just a tremendous amount of argument, and it's still fascinating for me to read about what those two terms meant historically. And, you had people looking at the same set of facts and the same legal precedents and coming up with completely different arguments. I mean, I think it was recognized that this commission was going to take, a very legalistic approach to this, in the sense of they view themselves as sort of being meticulous about what the statute does and doesn't say. And so I think parties on both sides really focused on going back to these pre-Bell breakup cases where computer data services first started to be available, and there was concern that AT&T, who had the monopoly at the time, would squelch or competition, would essentially squelch other companies from providing those services over the network that they controlled. And so there was a series of FCC cases that even predated the breakup of the Bell system, that started to recognize that there was this ability of the monopolist to squelch new services from being available. So, it's a very rich area of argument when you look at historically how we've regulated our networks in this country. It's changed over time, and we had different priorities over time. And we did shift more to a pro-competition approach, but we never. I'll say one other thing, and Jen, I'm not being too responsive to your question because the comments were so voluminous, but this is a point I wanted to make. Back in the day, during the Bell breakup, during even as late as when we started to see DSL and Comcast, the first broadband internet access, you really had this giant voice network, and then these little bits of it that were increasingly getting devoted to access to the internet. And now the situation is completely reversed, where you have a giant sort of IP network. There's very little of the old legacy voice network left. And that's the Title II network. That's the network that was always the big regulated network. And then there were these information services that were kind of riding on top of it. And the situation's now completely reversed itself to where there's barely any of the Title II network left, given this latest decision. And it's a fair question is whether that's what Congress intended, and that a lot of these definitional arguments about what's information services and what's telecommunication services never contemplated a world where there really were no telecommunication services. It was always a world in which information services was a component of this larger telecommunications world. So, that's, I think, when you try to, so there was a lot of argument among the carriers about those terms and what the historical context was. And I think it tended to ignore the point that I just made, which is that it's very not clear that Congress intended us to have a completely deregulated system with no common carrier responsibilities whatsoever. I think it's hard to look at the old laws from '96 and conclude that, but that's what the FCC's essentially concluded.
All right, thank you for that one. So I have another question related to sort of the efforts in the states and what they're doing right now, and ultimately what will happen once we have sort of a uniform approach to this at the national level. Will the state laws or the state things that are put in place, regulations that are put in place, supersede what's happening at the national level? And for our community, does that have any impacts for the way that we're going to be running our regionals and our national network?
Well, so since the RNE networks are exempt from all of this before and after, um, you know, it shouldn't affect what you do. Now, to the extent you guys respond to procurements at the state level, and you're willing to offer these, and I don't know whether you do that. Honestly, I probably should, but you know, I know you guys have your own commitments to your customers about how you're going to run the network. So, I don't know, what role you might play in kind of the, working with the states to be an alternative service provider. But setting that aside, I would expect there to be lawsuits seeking stays of these state regulations, particularly the ones like the one in Washington State, where I think there'll be a court case pretty quickly to try to stop that rule from taking effect. I mean, that's what you have to watch, is whether the rule is actually allowed to come into effect and whether the carriers actually begin to abide by it, or whether they take a very hard line and say, no, we can't abide by it without changing our whole network. And so they immediately go to court and try to seek and make an irreparable harm and try to seek an immediate stay. That'll be the next thing to watch in these state rules, is how quickly they get challenged by the ISPs in court. Now, the procurement ones are a little, I think it's the same thing. I really see the ISPs probably going after these procurement rules in the same way, arguing that they're effectively preempted by what the FCC's done.
Okay. I guess another sort of forward-thinking question on my part is, we had the 2015 ruling. Now we have a 2017 ruling. If there's a change in power yet again, is there going to be a 2021 ruling? Are we going to be dealing with this for the next couple of years where we're just constantly going back and forth?
I mean, that's the worst case scenario. And I think the answer is yes. If Congress doesn't resolve this, the courts are essentially arbitrary. You've got a very politically charged issue. You've got a set of rules that are more than 20 years old, or 20 years old now. 96 now. Yeah, we're at least, more than 20 years old, that don't necessarily fit the world today. And, the courts are going to only be able to do so much with that. The only way this ultimately gets resolved is if Congress passes a new law that makes clear what's allowed and what's not allowed and gives the FCC authority to enforce it. And until that happens, you will see this issue. You could see another 180 if the Democrats win the presidency in 2020. Absolutely. In fact, I'd almost guarantee it.
All right. Well, that's kind of a dour way to end. Is there any good news? Is there anything good that's going on in this spot right now?
Well, some of the more interesting stuff I've read recently is, so there's been, complaints that the large tech companies are increasingly clamping down on what speech in the social network context. And they're allowed to do that. There's nothing against the law for them to do that. And so I noticed Harold Feld the other day pointing from Public Knowledge, one of the public interest groups in favor of net neutrality, saying, making the point to the Republicans, look, you can't complain about that because, there's nothing discriminatory about that because these are private networks. And, sort of pointing out that the Republicans are taking place that, well, the Federal Trade Commission is going to be able to, take care of all this. Well, the Federal Trade Commission can't do anything unless someone's doing something deceptive or unfair. And whether it's the blocking of, bits on the internet or blocking of content on a social media site, neither of those practices are inherently unfair, to the point where it would allow the FTC to get involved. So I actually think where you're going to begin to see more pressure is just an effort to impose more requirements, not just on the ISPs, but on the tech companies. And so you may see a beginning of a shift of more attention to antitrust laws, applied not just to the ISPs and the vertical mergers, but also to the tech companies themselves. And you could see an emerging bipartisan consensus on that. That would be the thing I would watch for over the next few years. And you also have the tech companies getting a lot of pressure on the Russian meddling issue too, and you see that coming from the Democrats. So I really think you could see an emerging bipartisan consensus on regulation of the tech companies, which would then maybe that becomes part of a deal with net neutrality. I don't know. I mean, I'm sort of thinking out loud, but I guess what I would say is I think things are still very much in flux. You have seen, I don't see the issue settling down. I see it becoming bigger, and maybe incorporating more facets into it.
Well, I think that's a slightly better way to end it, that, it's not all gloom and doom, and hopefully this will lead to some better policy in the end. So I'll do one last call for questions here if anybody has them, and I'll thank you again for doing this. I think this has been great and helped me understand a little bit more about some of the background and some of the history here. And it looks like we may be done. So thank you again, Jeff, for your time today. I will stop the recording and we'll push this out to the website. And if you can just send me your slides, that'll be great.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks, everyone.
And for everybody else who's on, next week's talk is going to be on Stash Cache, which is a sort of open source RNE CDN type of solution. So we'll talk to everybody soon. Have a good weekend.